Good morning, everyone. Today is May 26th, 2022. Welcome to the New Possibilities Hour, part of the Will Work for Food project founded by Natalie Armstrong-Motin in the spring of 2020. Every Thursday morning, Jean Lawler and I, along with Natalie and Sarah Agamiri, host another incredible webinar focused on negotiation, mediation, arbitration, lawyering in general. And we have an incredible guest today, a wonderful guest today, Jonathon Graham, who's the General Counsel of Amgen. As you know, there is no charge for these great webinars. Rather, we ask you to contribute to a food bank if you like what you see. And so far, our audiences have been so generous in contributing money to food banks around the world in honor of our great speakers who volunteer their time for these purposes. It's always one of the highlights of the week to announce the running total of just how much money people have contributed to food banks. And I'm delighted to say that as of this week, $280,575.40. Yes, you heard right. Over $280,000 contributed by our generous audiences. Thank you so much, both to our audiences who are so incredibly generous and our many speakers over the last couple of years who have given just dynamite presentations, and today is going to be no exception. We're very honored to have Jonathon Graham with us. Jonathon is the Executive Vice President, General Counsel, and Secretary of Amgen, responsible for leading Amgen's global legal function. Amgen is a leading biotechnology company focused on serving patients with grievous diseases through innovation at the cutting edge of science. Before Jonathon joined Amgen in 2015, he was Senior Vice President and General Counsel at Danaher Corporation. Danaher's strategic business platforms include life sciences, diagnostics, and water technologies. Prior to Danaher, Graham was Vice President, Litigation and Legal Policy at General Electric Company, and before that, a partner with a busy trial practice at Williams & Connolly in Washington, D.C. He received his bachelor's degree with honors in economics from Pitzer College and a JD with honors from the University of Texas Law School, where he was editor-in-chief of the Law Review. After law school, he served as a law clerk to the Honorable Joseph T. Sneed, who was a United States Court of Appeals judge for the Ninth Circuit. What an impressive background. Today, John is going to talk to us about what one leading general counsel thinks constitutes good mediation and good mediators. It's going to be a terrific talk. We'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. Jonathon Graham, please tell us a little bit about the Manna Food Bank, where we hope people will be able to direct contributions. And then we look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Well, Manna Conejo Valley Food Bank is the food bank that is, I think, best known in the Conejo Valley. If you don't know the geography, and you probably don't, it's the it is the valley just past the valley in the LA area, and is a very busy and generally I would consider a fairly wealthy area. But like every part of the United States, we have a lot of people that need help with food, that they and their children's nutrition needs. We have our share of homeless folks, et cetera. It's close to our headquarters in Thousand Oaks, so people at Amgen have been over the years very involved with the Manna Conejo Valley Food Bank, and I'm no exception. I've had a chance to volunteer there a few times, and it's a great organization. So, you know, give often, give generously to the Manna Conejo Valley Food Bank. Hey, thanks for that introduction, Jeff. That was very kind, and thank Natalie and Sarah for setting this all up. As I was saying to them before I joined, they have a really very good pitch, at least the one that resonates very easily for me, which is, you know, spend a little time of preparation, think about some of the things that you've collected in the course of your career that you can share with other people that might be able to use some of those perspectives, and money shows up for a food bank. So for me, that's a total winner. So as Jeff said, I first started after law school. I had a trial / litigation practice. I actually did a fair amount of arbitration. I had a lot of mediations in the course of that. That was back in the day where many, if not most, mediations were court ordered, which of course meant that the parties were not necessarily excited about being there, and certainly not both parties all the time. Over the years, as mediation has become more and more acceptable to some and popular to others, it is more and more common to get parties in the room who are both actually interested in the process. As many of you who do this professionally know, the different parties in these processes often have very different perspectives on whether they want to be there or not. But at least it's something that I think good lawyers explain to their clients can be a very valuable method of getting something done and moving on with the dispute. And again, as the description of my career might indicate, now when I'm involved in mediations, they're almost always business-to-business mediations. Earlier in my career, I occasionally represented individuals, or individuals were on the other side. I think the dynamics in those kind of mediations can be quite different, as many of you on this call are well aware. But I think the general principles of what makes a good mediator are the same. So I have sort of I have a checklist, and I should mention that my colleagues at Amgen that do a lot of litigation / mediation / arbitration were kind enough to provide me with their insights and their perspectives as well. So I've sort of consolidated our Amgen view. First of all, preparation. Just nothing is more important than preparation. And guess what? That's the hallmark of any good lawyer, any good trial lawyer who wants to go into court. You got to know an awful lot about what's going on, what the facts are, what the law is, et cetera. Obviously, a good mediator, we wouldn't expect to be nearly as deep as the lawyers on each side, but it is truly nothing more frustrating than going to a mediation and realizing the mediator has not done his or her homework. Homework's important because a complete grasp of the facts and the law are just really helpful. And also, quite frankly, having a perspective, having a view on how those facts and law play out against that particular situation can be incredibly helpful. It just cuts through an enormous amount of explanatory nonsense at the beginning. And I'll come back to that preparation when I talk a little bit about what I think the best processes are. So in addition to preparation, I think intellectual capability is important. It helps to be smart. I think I can just leave it at that. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes the background of the mediator can be quite important. We do a lot of intellectual property work. Many of our intellectual property cases go to trial and aren't actually susceptible to mediation for reasons I won't bore you with here. But even in the cases that can be resolved, someone who has some basic grasp of the science can be very helpful. I know it is very common, many construction disputes are mediated, and it can be extremely helpful for people who have had a construction litigation background in order to be an effective mediator. I don't think this is true for all mediators, but I do think it is often the case, having a background, for example, in accounting can be quite helpful. And I know some mediation agreements actually specifically call out individuals, and an individual must have a specific background. But again, I don't think that's a core capability, but what I do think is a core capability is the captured by the phrase emotional intelligence. Mediators who can read the room, who can understand the different motivations going on in the room, that can understand that even at the same side of the table, even on the plaintiff side or the defendant side, within that side, the players there may have different motivations. Understanding obviously the level of authority that the players have on both sides in business to business litigation can be quite important. but really kind of figuring out who wants to do a deal, who doesn't, why they don't want to do a deal. Trying to pull that out is all a bit of understanding people and understanding what motivates them and how they might be persuaded to think about this situation differently. Good emotional intelligence is particularly useful on, I guess, what I would call the next trait, which is the creativity and flexibility. I have been stunned in the course of, I guess, more than 35 years now practicing law at how creative and thoughtful some mediators can be in order to change the dynamic in a room where things are stuck. It's a great thing to see, watch a professional, a really good mediator unstick a room by being creative or flexible in their approach. It's hard to define. It's one of those things that you know when you see it and you say, wow, I never would have thought of that. But that's a great trait. And then I guess when it comes to traits, I guess the final one is a mix of urgency and patience. So what do I mean by that? I'm sure all of you involved in mediation are familiar with the fact that as the clock ticks down toward whatever the appointed hour is, that's when things get serious, and there's a lot of I guess play acting and I will never, and this is not possible, and that's too much sort of stuff goes on, and it's not toward the end of a mediation that things get done. In complex business litigation, when those kind of cases are mediated, it's really important to get to that sooner, because it's really impossible to wrap things up in a complicated business matter in the last hour of a mediation. So I think there has to be a sense of urgency by the mediator to move things along. On the other hand, I said a good mediator has to have some patience. You can't bludgeon parties into settlement. I think that's a rare occasion when that can be done. And I think a good mediator often recognizes that he or she is part of a longer process, particularly in complex business litigation, where it may take 2, 3, 4 sessions in a mediation spread over a couple of years even in order to get to a resolution. And we've seen that happen a number of times at Amgen and at my previous company. And finally, communication. Communication is being able to accurately describe where you think the parties are, being able to, while doing that, also maintain confidence as to what you've been told you cannot share with the other side. But I think those just good, crisp, clear communication skills that accurately describe how you see where the other party is, to the extent you're able to do it. I've seen some mediations run off the rails when it became, and where it was not really, we couldn't understand why at the time, but later on, we realized that the mediator had not accurately conveyed one party's perspective or the other. Again, in complicated business litigation, that's quite important. And I think that's important, by the way, not just in evaluative mediation, but also in facilitative mediation. You just have to be able to be a good communicator. Let me just make a few comments about process, since I've talked about traits or characteristics, but process, going back to the preparation point, again, in the kind of mediations that we're engaged in, we have found it very helpful when the mediator reaches out to both sides in advance, tries to understand as much as they can before the mediation actually begins, as to what it is that you're, what the arguments are, what the facts are, what the background is, have the parties tried to settle anything before, where might the parties be, etc. So again, that goes to preparation, but we have found it very helpful when there's sort of a baseline knowledge where the mediators have private conversations with the parties beforehand. To me, one of my, I'm convinced that the reason mediations and negotiations of all kinds fail the most is that there's not a common set of, not a common understanding of what the facts are and how the law applies to that fact. So let's put how the law applies to the facts to the side, but having a common understanding of the facts. If the mediator can get the parties to agree, what do we agree about and what do we disagree about? And that can be challenging when the parties know that if the mediation fails, they're going to be in court, and they often don't want to give up some of the things that they believe they're going to be able to prove in court. And I certainly, remember that from when I was in practice at a mediation. Sometimes I was like, I'm not going to tell the other side that I have this, very devastating document that's going to harm one of their key things, because I'm just not going to give up that advantage. But nonetheless, when it comes, usually in business-to-business litigation and with the extensive discovery that goes on, both sides ought to get to a common factual foundation. Sometimes a mediator, especially in these ones that can last over a period of months and even years, one of the best things they can do is make sure the parties get to a common set of facts. And how do those facts play out when it comes to money, the amount of money that is involved? What are the potential damages, et cetera? So, getting to the facts that are agreed on and knowing which are disagreed upon is a very useful function for the mediator, and often is what can lead to a breakthrough. One of my colleagues sent me a note saying that a mediator ought to know how to land the plane. And what they meant by that was there are a lot of mediators that are very good at shuttle diplomacy. And I'll come back to shuttle diplomacy in a second, but going back and forth between the parties, accurately conveying, being a good communicator, not maybe browbeating is maybe a little bit too strong, but pressing both sides to get more reasonable, to get to recognize that in the end, they're going to have to be equally unhappy in order for the mediation to succeed. But the end game is the hard part. So going back and forth and conveying accurately and talking to people is one thing, but actually figuring out how are you going to get the parties to a signed agreement, either at that moment or very soon thereafter. I don't have any magic words on how that's done, but I think it's something that a mediator has to be thinking of from early on in the mediation, is what am I actually going to be able to get these parties to do? And I think that does separate good mediators from great mediators. And as I alluded to before, we think that mediators need to recognize that we're going to want them involved frequently after the first mediation session. It's not going to get done necessarily. It might get done in a couple of phone calls in the days after a mediation. That's pretty frequent, with the good graces of the mediator. And of course, the mediator ought to be compensated for that time, but recognizing this is not a one-day affair. This is a longer-term relationship with two parties who have wanted to work with you, and asking you to stay involved can be great. And sometimes it's been great. Sometimes when I've seen mediators of their own volition pick up the phone and call the parties afterwards and say, hey, I know you guys still are, aren't resolved, but I'm here. And by the way, I think if you did this, the other side might respond like, in a more constructive way, and vice versa. So I've been very impressed at mediators who have been able to, sometimes of their own volition, just stay involved and get the parties to move forward. So I think those are the main points I would make about characteristics of mediators and some of the process points, particularly from advantage of looking for complex ways to resolve complex business matters.
John, that's fantastic. Very insightful, and thank you. We'll open it up to questions from the audience in a few minutes. I had a few questions for you first, if I may.
Sure.
And as long as we're here talking about communication, let's communicate. Several of the points related to communication were very, very important. Let's start from the end. The end of the mediation day, when perhaps there's starting to be a sense that it may not settle that day, that people need time for new ideas to sink in and percolate, etc. Yet we as mediators would like to see cases settled that day if possible. Can you tell us about the communication and the teamwork between the mediator and the lawyers in terms of deciding when to step on the gas and pour it on and work harder and press harder, try to get it settled, and when it's time to take your foot off the gas and perhaps let people go home and sleep on it?
Yeah, well, I think, again, I think partly comes to emotional intelligence that we talked about earlier, reading the room, right? I don't think there's any simple formula. I do think that sometimes mediators, through the process of mediation, uncover the fact that the facts are actually widely, the understanding of the facts is widely disparate. So if the understanding of the facts is widely disparate, one of the best things a mediator might be able to do is say, maybe we should, cut this mediation short today. I'd ask you both to go and maybe exchange briefs or exchange through some way or another, come to a common understanding of these facts, and then let's get back together in 2 weeks. That's, a recognition that there's just complete disagreement about the facts in an evaluative style mediation is, to me, a sign, hey, we got to cut this short and figure out something, a way for facts to be exchanged. If you're engaged in the sort of mediation which I've seen performed brilliantly by some people, although I typically don't believe in it, but I have seen some mediators just say, hey, guys, look, you're at 550, you're at 400, let's cut the baby, and push people to the middle. And regardless of what the facts, some mediations do work out well that way. But to me, in these larger complex, millions or tens or hundreds of millions of dollars cases, making sure there's a common understanding of facts is awfully important. And then I guess the other thing is, I think you can kind of sense when people really want to settle. And that's, I think, a time to put on the gas, assuming you actually have people in the room who have the full authority to settle at the ranges you're talking about, which is another challenge sometimes in these complex business mediations. But if people have the will and they have a fair concurrence around the facts, you can get there.
That sense of settlement is so important. Many times in mediations, it seems to me there's a visceral, almost tangible moment where a dispute ceases to be a fresh wound for somebody and almost instantly becomes ancient history. Have you had that experience yourself? Can you comment on that phenomenon?
Yes. When I was in private practice, I had that experience more because the emotional content that is put into disputes, particularly by individuals and small companies, is typically a lot greater than it is in, among large companies. There's a lot within large companies. There may be some people who are really emotionally invested in the dispute, but you typically also have, there's a group that has to think about resolution of a really big, significant matter, and you drain some of the emotional content out of it. But certainly, when representing smaller companies and individuals, and sometimes a large company where the CEO himself or herself was heavily invested, getting to a point where the emotional content can be pulled out is very helpful. And a mediator, by the way, when you have the clients in the room, a mediator can sometimes be extremely effective in getting that individual over the hump that you just described, the emotional, okay, I've been heard, I've said my piece. I think a good mediator sometimes recognizes that having the parties in the room speaking to each other directly, especially at the start of a mediation, can exercise the demon that is within, where people need to say their piece and need to be angry. they get their anger out, and then you can see later on in those mediations that, just like a trial, sometimes you can lose a trial sometimes, but people will be satisfied that the process was fair and they got what they wanted, which was, they didn't get what they wanted exactly, but at least they got to say their piece. So I definitely think that that emotional content, recognizing it, can lead to those, moments in a mediation where everyone in the room realizes, oh, we're going to get this done.
So you talked about the joint session, people talking to each other, particularly at the beginning of a mediation. I think we have an experience, at least in the United States, that many mediators and a lot of partners in significant law firms and in-house lawyers dread and fear those opening joint sessions and tell mediators they abhor them, don't want to participate in them at all. There's no purpose. It'll be counterproductive. And yet you just talked about it as potentially very productive. Can you comment on distinguishing those situations where it would help versus where it might hurt, and what mediators can do to manage that kind of process to try to increase the likelihood it'll be productive?
Yeah. Well, I think I have a difference of opinion from many of my own colleagues, and they're in the fray, so I often defer to them on this. I found when I was in private practice, particularly if there was an individual or a smallish entity, that it was helpful for people to get in the room at the beginning and hear the other side's perspective in sort of a setting, it's this formal setting. Again, I never did this in the virtual world, of course, but it's a formal setting. There's a mediator there. The mediator is, looking businesslike and, has the trappings of a proceeding. And so an individual that hears how they hears directly from the other side and has their own chance to have even themselves sometimes, but usually their lawyer advocate their side. I always found, almost always, that was helpful. Occasionally it made people more angrier, but that's the mediator's job, is to, in those cases, to say, look, this is, you're going to hear the same stuff in court. You might as well hear it here now and think about it. So as I've been in charge at companies where we had much more complex arbitrations, mediations, disputes generally, and where there's been a lot of back and forth between the sides already before mediation. I mean, a lot of court filings, a lot of back and forth. I think it is less, I've been persuaded that it is yet less useful for both sides to actually talk to one another. Frankly, I'm not convinced of that. I do think it does help to for the advocates, and it's almost always the advocates, not typically the clients, but hopefully the clients are in the room. They certainly would be if our company was involved. When I say the clients, I mean typically one of our litigators, and sometimes, once in a while, one of our business people. That can be, I'm not convinced that that's not useful, but I know that's become the trend.
It sometimes seems in those larger business-to-business cases, John, that the mediator has an additional task of mediating between factions or groups on the side of the large organization. I suppose the archetype of that would be between the marketing people who want to get things out to market and the engineering people who perhaps want to go a little more slowly. Can you comment on how it works from your perspective? Can mediators be helpful in negotiating between different factions or different groups within a large corporate entity?
I think privately, I'm not sure it can be done during the mediation, although I'm lucky that I've always had extremely capable litigation teams on my team, who we try to sort those things out beforehand. And it is frequently the case. I actually think sometimes The bigger disagreements are between the finance teams and the legal teams. Sometimes it's the sales team that just wants to get a dispute over, and a legal team that is saying, wait a minute, you're giving up a vast amount of shareholder money here to get this over. So I think it's incumbent maybe on the mediator to try to discern, is there a disagreement between the different groups within the company, and whether the mediator can be helpful in that regard or not. Maybe the mediator can explain to one faction or the other some of the way, the way that these processes work. I think, though, that that's usually limited to companies that don't have as sophisticated litigation practice as the companies that I've been lucky enough to be associated with. So I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that. I can't think of a situation where that would have ever helped in my case.
So all of these emotional facts, background facts, all these other considerations, in my practice, we try to surface those in those pre-mediation telephone calls where we've gotten the brief. The briefs typically lay out the strengths and weaknesses of claims and defenses. And they don't talk about the human factor, the personality factors, either because lawyers are unskilled at writing about those things or uncomfortable. What lawyer is going to put into writing, my own client is a hothead, or my own client is very stubborn, or whatever? Can you talk more about the pre-mediation communications, the processes of what you think should go into a brief and what should be the content of those telephone calls?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. And I think the telephone calls are a great opportunity for a mediator to ask the advocate, presumably they're talking to an advocate in the pre-mediation calls, about those very factors. Hey, tell me about your client. If it's a business, is there one decision maker? Is that decision maker on board with, with where you're going? Is your client a hothead? And I think good lawyers in private practice are usually willing to, assuming they think mediation is a good idea, which is not always the case, by the way, but if they think the mediation is a good idea, I think they'll often be glad to reveal those kind of facts. I certainly felt comfortable doing that when I was in private practice, that, I have a client here who is, might be an individual who feels, really taken advantage of, and, is so angry about what happened to him or her. On the flip side, I'm representing a company that, this case is more about the principle than it is about the money. So I think it's going to be very challenging to resolve unless the other side will concede the principle, and then we can talk about the money. Those sort of, for some businesses, the principle is important because it's the foundation. That particular principle may be the foundation of their business. And so they can't afford to ever concede on that principle, and money is not as important to them. So that's something that, when a mediator recognizes that, is can really help you get to a settlement, because different people are valuing different things differently. Principle for one, money for the other. So those kind of conversations, I think, are critical and can be very helpful. Again, the more emotional content there is in the dispute, the better for that particular technique.
John, my sense is that nobody ever concedes on a matter of principle. When they hear the word compromise, people just hook up the word unprincipled to the word compromise. And I try not to use the word compromise. I find that I try to express competing principles: not spending excess money, not wasting money, being able to return your full attention to your business and become more economically productive. Those are principles as well. Is it your experience that people actually give up on things that are a matter of principle, or are there other ways to approach it?
I think it depends how foundational the principle is. I think the technique you just identified is when talking about principles is a good one, but I do think it's, foundational. Let me give an example of something that might be important to a company. This is not from my own company at all, but if you're a software company and all you have is software that you've developed, and one of your developers takes that software to a competitor, the principle there is more about getting the software back and getting an acknowledgement that the software can never be used by the other company, more than it is, perhaps, I'm just speculating here or hypothetically here, than it is about the money damages involved. And you can see why that's the sort of principle that the other side, I think, ought to be able to accept. If there is a factual agreement that code has been stolen, for example, and is now being integrated into someone else's platform. So that's, I guess one side is going to say their principle is that we're not going to be called a thief. But, I think weighing up principles the way that you just outlined it is can be a helpful way to deal with it. And I think sometimes I think what you're really kind of poking at there is that sometimes people hide behind principle in order to establish their bona fides about how tough they're going to be in this mediation. They use it almost in place of fact and law. And so I think, the techniques you identified are a good way to get around that using principle as a facade for something else.
It's the statements of principle, perhaps maybe more 10 in the morning tactics rather than 4 in the afternoon tactics.
Yes, I think that's right for some, certainly in some cases.
Let's go back to those preliminary phone calls. One other question on that. My sense is that if you're not comfortable confiding in the mediator some of these points about relationships with your own clients and personalities, you've probably picked the wrong mediator. You should pick a mediator with whom you're comfortable having those kind of conversations. And yet not every mediator is going to be able to get on wavelength with everybody. So let's open up the black box a little of how mediators get selected or deselected. What about this idea of emotional intelligence, the ability to get on wavelength with people, the ability to read rooms, establish rapport with people who are sometimes in very upset states of mind, or sometimes they're just difficult personalities? How do you screen mediators for those kind of emotional competencies?
Yeah, I think that's pretty hard to do, actually. It often depends. In the business setting, you have an agreement that says, some third party will, offer, 5 mediators, and then you stack rank them, and whoever through stack ranking gets, the both sides have done, you get that person. You're stuck. But what we try to do is, and I think every large company tries to do, is try to understand who are the people on this list, or who are the people that we might propose if there is no process like I just described that would be acceptable to the other side, but that have the characteristics that we think are necessary. So, because, I'll say immodestly, we often think we're right. So we often want mediators that we think are smart, are capable, and have a track record, through what we hear from advocates that have appeared before them, have a track record of being good at reading the room, and who are sophisticated and smart in the kinds of things that we are disputing. So, we do research on people, and the research is often, guess what? It's the kind of research where you call people up and say, hey, have you ever dealt with this person? Was this person a good mediator? Oh, by the way, it's always good to know if the person, quote, lost in the mediation in front of that person, because that may taint their view of them. I think it's, we do what we can, and we're lucky enough to have the resources and the contacts to almost always learn something about proposed mediators, or to find a mediator. Often a business agreement will say a mediation will be held in, must be held in Miami, Florida. We're probably not going to pick a mediator from Portland, Oregon. And we'll try to figure out through our contacts, who in the Florida area is known for having these characteristics, who has the smarts and the emotional intelligence to get something done. But it's a human, it's a human thing. And I think one of the things that we know, I would just make one comment on diversity generally here. We know that the social science is pretty clear, and I think you don't need a lot of social science to know that people like to hire people like themselves. I think that's one of the things that we have to sort of break through as a legal community, is that we don't always have to hire people like ourselves to help us resolve problems, that the ability to problem solve is equally distributed among people of all different kinds of backgrounds. Being open to mediators of all kinds. I've been practicing law long enough so that it was unusual when women were mediators. And I think that's not at all unusual now, for example. I encourage people to have an open mind when they're choosing mediators. And for those mediators out there to, I think your goal in, let's admit there are many motivations in the room, right? The mediator wants to get the parties to a resolution, and wants to become known as someone who can get parties to a resolution. But the getting known part is part of their emotional intelligence in interacting with both sides, in a way that both sides walk away, and the advocates on both sides would walk away and say, the result was X, and I like her, I'm going to hire her again. So that's I think that's all I can say on that.
That's all very important. I know that many of the mediators on this call right now, and those who will be watching the recording, would love to work with a big company like yours, whether it's on the biggest antitrust or patent case, or an employment case, or simply somebody who slips and falls in your lobby and breaks an ankle. What can mediators do to come to the attention of you or someone in a position like yours? What are the turn-ons and turn-offs?
I think I just alluded to them. I think you build a practice in mediation like you do build a practice in any kind of law, which is you put your nose down, you work hard, you develop a reputation as someone who gets things done, and then it depends on the audience. Marketing a practice of mediation, I think is tough. I'll be candid. If someone sends me I get dozens of marketing emails. Most of them are screened out by our automatic, screeners at our company. But I nonetheless end up, some chunk of my day is just deleting, come-ons for all sorts of legal services. Now, when it comes to, mediators or lawyers looking for more business, I know that people on my team that have those particular specialties spend a few more seconds before they delete those same emails. But I think the real way to, I guess I'm old-fashioned. I think the real way to build a practice is to do good work and get known in the legal community, and have, be visible, and have people know you and think, oh, I'm going to give this person a shot. I'll be candid, when we're doing a mediation worth, $300 million, we're not interested in people that haven't had a large, successful, I should say, has had a successful practice of resolving significant, sophisticated disputes in the past. And I would mention, by the way, that, for better or worse, those kinds of mediators typically have worked in a large law firm for some period of time, or been a general counsel or the head of litigation at a large company for some period of time. When it comes to employment litigation, which we certainly have our share of, then the aperture is much wider for employment litigation. But honestly, it's rare that someone that we would think of to be a mediator for even a really important employment litigation matter for us would end up being chosen for a multi-$100 billion mediation matter.
Okay, let's return before we give the audience some time to ask questions too. There's one more thing I wanted to address relating to communication during the mediation day. You talked a lot, John, about the mediator shuttling information, factual information, particularly back and forth between the sides. A lot of your cases, intellectual property cases, for example, involve a lot of scientific and technical engineering material, and the mediator is generally the least knowledgeable person in the room about the facts of the case. You all have been working on it for months or perhaps years. We got the briefs perhaps a week or 10 days before the mediation. And even a mediator who's well versed in patent law, for example, or procedures of the federal courts, is not going to be as up to speed on the particular science and technology involved in the case. In my own experience, it's helpful to promote direct communication on these subjects, at least between the lawyers in what I sometimes call summit meetings between the lawyers, or perhaps an all-hands meeting, even if we've had a joint session at the beginning of the day, to have additional direct communication sessions or joint sessions during the day, particularly when we're talking about factual disputes, the communication of scientific and technical material. What's your view on that kind of communication and preventing the kind of situation where a mediator might inadvertently misstate something scientific or technical, or where a mediator might be asked a question to which the mediator has no idea what the answer might be?
Yeah, well, I think you just hit on it there at the end. If the mediator doesn't know or isn't sure that they know, they should use those really very important words, I don't know, because that builds credibility. And then the next words should be, but let's figure out a way to find out. And I think that the sort of joint sessions, again, as I indicated earlier, I'm in favor in mediations of at appropriate times having the parties be in the same room at the same time and see if they can or cannot agree on something. Now, for the reasons you just identified, a mediator, just like a judge, cannot necessarily, and it's much harder for a mediator to figure out who's right if there's a disputed fact in a complex scientific matter. It's just not possible, reasonable, and neither side can think that it is. At least in court, a judge sees expert witnesses and can judge credibility and cross-examination. You're just not going to get that in a mediation, right? So I do think it's important to still have both sides express their points of view. And that may, by the way, be part of the step to, another day, 3 months down the road, when the parties have heard, after they've thought about what they heard at the mediation and the other side said about that set of facts, that may make them reconsider and realize that they're in a weaker position than they thought they were, or that the other side has a fundamental misunderstanding of a basic premise behind those facts. So I would roll those things together. You can't possibly know what the parties know. It's not an expectation of a mediator, but you can set up circumstances for an exchange of views on those critical differences.
And that's really where the creativity comes in. isn't it, for the mediator to create the environment for the people most knowledgeable about the circumstances to devise the solutions that are best for them?
I think that's a very good summary, and it's always marvelous to behold when someone is able to do that for two parties, otherwise locked into a death grip of dispute.
We agree. We agree. I know we've got an audience full of terrific people here who are probably burning with questions on their own minds. And John, you're so candid and so knowledgeable. I'd like to give people in the audience an opportunity to pose questions. Please just feel welcome to unmute yourself, say who you are and where you're from, and ask your question. I hope we have some takers. Otherwise, I'll have to call on Mark Harwell to go first. Oh, Greg Whitehair, go ahead. Please unmute yourself.
Good morning. Thank you. And thank you for this presentation. I really appreciate it. I do mostly patent mediations. And one of the things that comes up for me, and I'm sure you face it, your opponent is rather unsophisticated. And I'm guessing for Amgen in particular, and the big companies like that, but they have a dog with a bone. Either the lawyer or the client on the other side is convinced of their patent position, or they're convinced of the licensing interpretation, and you know that they're just off kilter. And your mediator shares your view, but how do you communicate? What steps can you take to support the mediator, so the mediator isn't necessarily coming in going, gosh, you're a fool, you need to stop, your position is very unlikely to be upheld? Because as a mediator, it becomes very difficult for me to continue in that room if I ever take such a harsh evaluative position with a party. But if I had tools, and so what kind of tools do you see you're being made available or providing to the other side? Do you share your mediation brief, for instance? Do you share information? Because oftentimes it's almost a religious debate.
Yeah, great question. So I think there's a couple pieces to think about there. One is you, Greg, should be in the position of asking me, hey, give me more ammunition to demonstrate to them in a calm, rational way why their position isn't likely to be successful. And that ought to be we ought to be prepared enough for the mediation to provide that sort of information to help you persuade the other side. And then on the sort of larger emotional piece, maybe this won't resolve now, but maybe there's someone at our company that can talk to someone at their company. It depends who's in the room, right? If the CEO of the other company is already in the room, maybe that won't work. But there are cases where after mediations, I may not have been involved in the mediation myself. One of my super capable lawyers on our team has been there, and maybe afterwards I can pick up the phone and in another week or so call the general counsel on the other side and say, hey, I know our teams had this mediation, didn't succeed. I would, you might want to think about this or that. You might want to call. One thing I've done in the past, I've said, the parties in the mediation appear to be really dug in. Your lawyer's really dug in. Have you considered asking another lawyer with an expertise in this area about this particular area of law or fact? Because, and I'll just say it very reasonably, I got the impression that I heard that the mediator, was talking to your outside lawyers about this and didn't seem to make much progress. We're pretty convinced that we're right about this. Maybe you ought to get a second opinion on this piece. So that helps if you feel comfortable at the mediation telling us what the obstacles are on the other side, we can feed hopefully helpful information during the mediation. And then again, afterwards, I might have the ability, or someone on my team might have the ability to talk to someone on the other side and say, hey, here's another way we might be able to get around this.
Jonathan, this is Mark Harwell. I would just like to hear your thoughts about the timing on the joint session, because you spoke about emotional intelligence, and I'm just wondering, oftentimes it seems as though parties expect a joint session to be held at the start of the mediation, and I'm not so certain that that's always the most appropriate time for the joint session because of the emotional aspect of it.
Honestly, I would defer to you in that case because, my own predilection would be to do it at the beginning, but you've seen a lot more mediations as a mediator than I have. And so I would think the situations where it's wise and not wise to do that. The reason I've always liked it, again, this is largely from my experience when I was an advocate, is I wanted to have an opportunity, particularly if the client was going to be there on the other side, for them to hear, in a rational, logical way, what we thought the strengths were of our matter. And by the way, to acknowledge where we were weak as well. I always felt that was a good way to show credibility going into a mediation. So, but that was just the way I preferred it. And you have a lot more experience at how this works than having seen presumably many mediations. So I would go with your own gut and ignore what the clients want.
Wonderful presentation, Jonathan. Thank you.
Well, John, ignoring what the clients want has its own risks attendant to it, doesn't it? Have you seen mediators effectively overcome that kind of resistance? And if so, how have you seen it work?
Yeah, well, as the old saying goes, show me the money. So if you resolve the dispute and you did it in a way that I initially disagreed with, I'm with you. I'm like, okay, that person, this requires a little bit of humility among the clients. And I admit that not all clients have that humility, but if Mark starts off a mediation in a way that I disagree with, and yet in the end, Mark lands the plane, to use one of my colleagues' expressions, then I will, Mark is on my list going forward, even though I didn't agree at the time.
Well, that's an interesting question, because there are some mediators out there who are notorious for peppering the mediation with F-bombs, threats, finger in your face, very heavy-handed tactics. What's the borderline? When does a mediator go so far that you will say, you know what, the mediator got the deal done, but I felt so crummy about the experience, I'm not going back?
Well, that's, let's put it this way. When I was in private practice, I might have had one view about that. Now that I have some insulation from being in the actual mediation most of the time myself, I might have a different view. I have to, I've seen mediators being very forceful before. I've never seen the, I guess our society's gotten cruder over the last 35 years, so I haven't heard a lot of F-bombs, but I guess some people use that. So I don't know. I think it's sort of individual. There's I don't know. I'd have to hear more about that experience before I would. There'd be an asterisk by that person's name. Let's put it that way.
Fair enough. This has been a fantastic hour. Jonathon Graham of Amgen Corporation, thank you so much for a truly wonderful, insightful presentation for all of us. I know that the Manna Food Drive of the Conejo Valley in California will benefit greatly from contributions made in your honor as a result of this incredible presentation. The website is Manna Conejo. That's www.mannaconejo.org. That's www.mannaconejo.org. Thank you so much, Jonathan, our wonderful audience, for being here. Natalie, Sarah, Jean Lawler in her absence today, thank you as well. And with that, we are complete.
Goodbye.